This is Bradbury 100, celebrating the centenary year of American writer Ray Bradbury. I'm Phil Nichols of bradburymedia.co.uk. Each week on the podcast, we look at some aspect of Bradbury's life and work and interview someone who is inspired by Ray. Welcome to the second episode of Bradbury 100. In today's show, I'll be interviewing someone who works to preserve and provide access to Ray Bradbury's manuscripts, papers, and personal effects. And that's Jason Aukerman, the managing director of the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies, which is in Indianapolis. Now, before we get to the interview, I'd like to tell you something about my own experience of working with the Bradbury Center in conducting my own research. Today, the centre is transforming itself into a museum and a place where anyone can go to get sight of Ray's old office. They've recreated his office using all original furniture, which was kindly gifted to the centre when Ray died in 2012. But the Centre for Ray Bradbury Studies used to be a much smaller affair, just a couple of very tightly packed rooms filled with filing cabinets and books. I think I first visited there in 2009, when the centre had been formally operating for just a couple of years. I was looking to do some research into Ray's media work, which is my thing, in support of my website at that time, and to follow up a couple of journal articles I'd written about Ray's radio plays and adaptations of his stories. At that time, the centre was able to provide access to an excellent collection of Ray's correspondence, from which I was able to see letters he'd written to people like the playwright and director Norman Corwin, film director Francois Truffaut, Twilight Zone creator Rod Serling. There was also an impressive collection of magazines containing Ray's stories and essays, everything from the old pulp magazines of the 1940s through to copies of Playboy and other classy publications that later carried Ray's work. Oh, and books, of course. Nearly every edition of every Bradbury book, including many foreign language editions. And many contextual books, that is to say, books about Ray, books about science fiction, books about horror, books about popular culture, and so on. Now, the two people behind the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies were its co-founders, Jonathan R. Eller and William F. Touponce. Separately, these two scholars had published articles and books on Ray's work, and together they had completed the mammoth study, Ray Bradbury, The Life of Fiction. Now, this one book, it's quite a thick book, really kicked at everything that previous scholars had written about Ray's work. Much of the general scholarly opinion of Ray had been formed by about 1980, but this book, which came out in the 2000s, gave everything a bit of a kick. So what did scholars think of Ray? Well, generally, they saw him as a genre writer with a poetic turn of phrase, someone who had done his best work in the 1950s, and if you were going to study him at all, you'd better focus on Fahrenheit 451, since nothing else measured up to that. Well, what Eller and Touponce did in The Life of Fiction was show that there was so much more to Ray than Fahrenheit. They painstakingly dug into the history of how Ray had created each of his books and revealed what we might call the poetics of his work, how Ray uses language, imagery, recurring themes. If you're interested in this sort of thing, Life of Fiction is well worth getting hold of. Now, it turns out that John Eller is the textual historian. He will trace back through Ray's manuscripts and figure out how he wrote, say, Dandelion Wine or Fahrenheit 451, while Bill Touponce was the literary theorist who enjoyed looking for literary themes and devices, Ray's use of masks in the Martian Chronicles, his use of carnivals and circuses, and Bill would relate these to literary theories from people like Bakhtin. Now, oddly, Eller and Touponce met really by coincidence, and from their shared interest in Bradbury, they developed a number of projects together which established the Centre for Ray Bradbury Studies, Life of Fiction, which I've already mentioned, a journal called the New Ray Bradbury Review, a critical edition of Ray's collected stories, and books on It Came from Outer Space and The Halloween Tree, and much more. Bill Touponce eventually retired, but even in retirement he continued researching and publishing. Sadly, though, he died in 2017, but John Eller continues to direct the Bradbury Centre to this day. Now, when I first visited the Bradbury Centre back in 2009, it was really like John and Bill's study. It was a relatively small space, packed full of all their reference materials. And it was a great place to be for someone like me, giving access to almost everything I could want to research Ray's work. Now, unfortunately, of course, Ray Bradbury passed away in 2012. But this sad circumstance led to the eventual expansion of the Bradbury Centre and the development of its outreach program, which it operates today. When Ray died, most of his vast personal archive, his papers, his letters, all of this was left to his long-time bibliographer and friend, Don Albright. And Don generously turned it over to the Bradbury Centre, and this drastically expanded its collection almost overnight. Truckloads of material was shipped in from California, where Ray lived, to the Bradbury Centre in Indiana. The filing cabinets and boxes were put into this large, empty computer lab on the campus of IUPUI in Indianapolis, and had to be slowly catalogued and incorporated into the centre. And I was lucky enough to be given access to all this new material shortly after it had shipped. On one of my visits, John Eller kindly gave me free rein to work through the cabinets and boxes, researching whatever I needed. And by this point, I was doing a PhD on Ray's script writing, and it was a real privilege to be seeing inside these filing cabinets, which were pretty much as Ray had left them just a couple of years earlier. Now, a couple of years further on, in 2017, I was able to return to the centre and see it pretty much as it is now. It's in a bigger location with room for these dozens of cabinets brought in from California, and with one room dedicated to a carefully crafted reconstruction of Ray's working office. Ironically, the Centre for Ray Bradbury Studies is jam-packed once again. It moved into much bigger accommodations, but once all these new materials were brought in, it was full again. Well, nowadays, the centre allows visitors and researchers to view Ray's manuscripts, multiple drafts of books and film scripts, more correspondence files than ever before, and also a huge collection of Ray's toys and trinkets, memorabilia and awards. And we'll hear more about these in our interview with Jason coming up. Now, you may be asking, who cares about some dusty old collection of papers? Well, anyone with an interest in Ray's work. You can see from these how he went about drafting his stories, with rewrite after rewrite as he pursued perfection. You can see what influenced him. The books from his own personal library, everything from Edgar Rice Burroughs to George Bernard Shaw. You can see the robots, the rocket ships, his model of the Nautilus. Oh, and the artwork. Ray didn't just let his books go out with any old cover on them. He took particular care over what his books should look like. And the Bradbury Centre has lots of covers and posters from Ray's films and so on display. If you're intrigued, there is a virtual 3D tour you can take online. I'll give you a link on my website so you can take a look. And as for my own research, the last time I was in the Bradbury Centre, I was trying to collate a complete set of scripts from Ray's TV series, The Ray Bradbury Theatre. From previous visits, I was pretty sure that all the scripts were there somewhere, but with the collection still being catalogued, nobody was really able to point to any one place and say, there they are. So I was determined to track each script and every draft of each script. And I succeeded. There is indeed at least one draft of every single one of those 65 scripts. Well, more than 65, because Ray wrote a couple more that weren't actually filmed. Fortunately, Ray kept almost everything, mostly for himself, I'm sure, but in so doing, he also succeeded in keeping everything for future generations, so we can keep studying his work and his creative process for years to come. Don't forget there'll be some show notes on my website, bradburymedia.co.uk, where I'll post links to the Bradbury Centre. And now it's time to meet this week's guest on Bradbury 100. Once again, I'm going to apologise if the sound quality is a bit below par. We really must get some better internets. But I'll just start by saying I have with me today Jason Aukerman, who is the Managing Director of the Centre for Ray Bradbury Studies. The first question, Jason, is tell us something about the Centre for Ray Bradbury Studies. What is it? What does it do?
The Center for Ray Bradbury Studies is a museum, archive, reference library on the campus of Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. We've got about, I would say, 150,000 pages of Bradbury's personal papers, manuscripts, early drafts of stories, correspondence, and a lot of his personal effects, a lot of his audio and video recordings, and enough of his personal items that we have recreated his basement office at his Los Angeles residence with entirely original artifacts. His working library, both of his writing desks, 4 of his typewriters, and a lot of the dinosaurs and other toys that he played with, even into his 80s, are right there in the office as well. So visitors can actually literally walk right into Ray Bradbury's office. We also have a number of his awards and mementos, his Emmys, his Pulitzer, numerous ACE cable TV awards, National Book Award, National Medal of Arts, and we curate all of that in the stuff.
So, in a way, the title Centre for Ray Bradbury Studies is a little bit misleading because it sounds more like a museum collection or even a visitor attraction if you allow people in and give them tours.
Yeah, absolutely. Before the virus hit, we've had to pivot quite a bit as a result of COVID-19. But yeah, we hosted tours. And you're right that the title is misleading, but the title comes from a period before we had all those materials. The center was originally founded to promote scholarship on Ray Bradbury. The world of Ray Bradbury scholars is limited now. It was even more so limited in the late 80s and early 90s. And just by a happy accident, 2 of the world's leading scholars on Ray Bradbury ended up employed at Indiana University, Dr. Bill Toupons and Dr. Jonathan Eller. And the 2 of them established the center, so they kicked off the New Ray Bradbury Review, which is a scholarly journal on the works of Ray Bradbury. And they also put together the Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, which tracks Bradbury's earliest stories, and through manuscript study and other things, they try to find Bradbury's original settled intent for his short stories before they reached the publishers and got into the hands of editors. What did he originally intend for the story to be?
So that's quite intense work, isn't it? Involving looking at not only published versions of the story, of which there may be many, but also looking at the original manuscripts and variations on those manuscripts.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's not my specialty. That's really Dr. Eller's expertise.
Can you tell us a little bit then about what your role is? I gather that it's developed over time.
I came into a brand new PhD program at IUPUI that required an internship. So a third of the PhD is an internship. And I enrolled in the track for the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies. And so my internship was in the center. And from the very beginning, the plan was a succession plan. Dr. Eller, who is the co-founder of the center, and he's still our current director, he's ready to retire. So when he retires, I'm going to take over the director role of the center. But really, the mission of the center expanded in ways that we never could have envisioned from the onset. The purpose for the center when it was originally established. When we received, after Bradbury's passing in 2013, in 2014, his personal effects, we became a massive archive in a museum in addition to a scholarly publishing center. The title didn't change, and we didn't get any additional support. So really, Dr. Eller has been wearing many, many hats the last few years, and I'm going to try to wear as many of those hats as well. Really my job in the center is, one, to make it available. We're curating the material legacy of Ray Bradbury, and to make this available to the public, as Ray Bradbury and his family wished, is an enormous responsibility, especially when you have a very limited staff. And my role at the university is actually primarily faculty. I'm a clinical assistant professor of English and American Studies, and I have a heavy teaching load that goes along with my responsibilities to the center.
Do you get the opportunity to use Bradbury in your teaching?
Oh, absolutely. I encountered Bradbury, I believe, for the first time. I don't recall ever reading Bradbury in high school or college, but I was aware of Fahrenheit 451, and I knew that was an important book to read. So when I was no longer being assigned books to read, that was one of the first books that I picked up and read, and it had an impression on me. But I hadn't really read anything else by Bradbury until I started teaching in 2012. I'd finished my first master's degree, and the university I was working for, I was in development. I was fundraising for the university at the time. They needed people to teach freshman composition, and my goal from the very beginning in choosing English as a major, I wanted to go on and get a PhD and teach full time. And so I accepted the opportunity. Of course, freshman composition is the class that no student wants to take, and for the most part, no professor wants to teach. And I knew how to write, but I had no idea how to teach other people. So I was teaching 25 freshmen in a computer lab, which was fortunate because every night I would prepare a lecture for the students that I think would take, the better part of the hour. And 15 to 20 minutes in, I was through all of my slides. I was out of things to say. Who can stand up in front of people and talk about writing for an hour? Especially starting out, that was difficult. So I would make up writing prompts right there on the spot and have the students write. And that corresponded with my experience in learning how to write. You learn to write by writing. By the time late September rolled around, we'd been in class for 5 or 6 weeks, and the students were starting to felt like they were on to me. I didn't really know what I was doing, and I needed something to validate my approach and having them write so much, especially during class time. And so I consulted Dr. Google and came across this clip where Ray Bradbury is wearing a white sports coat, white undershirt, white shorts, white socks. He looks absolutely ridiculous in a way, and charming at the same time. And he's talking about his experience becoming a writer and writing every day for 10 years. And after 10 years, he wrote this short story called The Lake, and how the experience writing that story really opened his eyes. That at that point, he had become a writer. And he wasn't writing for anybody else. He wasn't writing for this magazine or that magazine. He'd come into his own, and he'd found his voice as a writer. And that concept of writing persistently and writing yourself into competence perfectly aligned with what I was trying to do in the classroom. So I shared that video clip with my students and got a copy of the October Country and read The Lake aloud in class. And that was my very first attempt at teaching college writing. I've taught it every semester since. And Ray Bradbury, that video clip is shown to my students, and I read The Lake every year. So that's he's been an important part of my teaching. Absolutely love that story. It's a workshop that my students always seem to enjoy.
That's brilliant. That's one of my favourite stories. And it's you kind of imagine Bradbury sitting there at his typewriter day after day after day, year after year, in fact. And then one day that one comes out on the paper.
Yeah.
And it must have been quite astonishing that for him to have even noted himself that it was the story that proved he was a writer after being at it for a number of years. I don't know many other writers who can really sort of pin down a particular day when their writing went from being okay to being superb.
Right.
It's an amazing moment, really. Let's just be a little bit frivolous now. There's all sorts of stuff in the collections in the Bradbury Centre. What's your favourite thing?
Oh, you would ask that, wouldn't you, Phil? Let's see here. I guess saying all of it's too much of a cop out, right? One thing that I really enjoy showing people is we have a film script in the center. It's a fourth draft that was composed by Bradbury's good friend Ray Brackett. Bradbury and Lee Brackett had a very close relationship throughout their lives. Lee really mentored Bradbury and helped teach him how to write for the pulps. In her early career, she got called to do the film script for The Big Sleep, and she was in the middle of a short story, a novelette called Lorelei and the Red Mist. And she couldn't finish it and go on to work in Hollywood at the same time. So she asked Bradbury to finish the story for her. And very few people know where Lee Brackett left off and Ray Bradbury picked up. So they had that close relationship. They knew how to write in each other's style and tone. And she was working on this film late in life, and she was sick. The people that were working on the film weren't exactly sure that she would be able to make it to the end. So they reached out to Ray Bradbury and said, "Can you guarantee her work?" And from what I understand, Bradbury agreed to guarantee her work, to finish the script if Lee Brackett could not, but under one condition, that she got full credit for it, that his name didn't appear anywhere in the credits. And they agreed, and Bradbury was keeping up with the film project, but he didn't have to work on it because Lee Brackett finished and passed away a short while after the script was complete. But we have evidence of it because there's a fourth draft of the script in the Bradbury Center, and that's for The Empire Strikes Back, the famous Star Wars film. So that's always a fun story to tell, and always fun to show people that manuscript as it's starting to get old and appears to have some sort of moisture damage on it. I also love Bradbury's Pulitzer Prize, partly because it's got a little chip in it, which is typical of Bradbury's. Many of his awards have a slight cosmetic damage, and it's because he played with them. He played with his toys, and these objects weren't necessarily things to be revered; they were to be enjoyed. And I think his Pulitzer really signifies that he found a way to navigate popular culture and what some people would call maybe the more elitist high culture. He's appreciated in both circles. So the Pulitzer's great. We also have an original Jack Kirby sketch of Mr. Miracle, and we had it framed in the center for the longest time, and I'd never taken it out or handled it. It was in a frame, and we set up the office for tours. We would display it, and we took it out of the frame recently just for better storage, for safer keeping, because it's an original Jack Kirby, and it's of Mr. Miracle, and I wasn't sure when it was given to him until we took it out of the frame, and I was able to see the back part of it. It's written on a cardboard poster for the 3rd annual Comic-Con in San Diego. And apparently Ray Bradbury and Jack Kirby were guests of honor one of the days during the convention, and they were hanging out at their table signing autographs. And I guess during the slow period, Jack must have decided, well, here, Ray, I'll sketch you a character that I've been working on recently. So that's a really charming piece in the collection. And, we have all kinds of scholar adventures in the Bradbury Center. As you know, Phil, you've been there before, and you've worked with us and you've conducted research there. But those are some of the highlights for me. And you never know what you're going to find. There are 150,000 pages. It's going to take us years to get through all of that, fully understand, and have the intellectual control that we need over the collection. But also, one of my favorite stories involves youth, as far as scholar adventures and interesting finds.
What's this?
Do you remember the last time you were there and you found a particular VHS?
Oh, is this Something Wicked This Way Comes?
Yes.
You
want to tell that story?
Well, this was something I had assumed must exist somewhere, but I'd never seen any evidence that it existed, and that was the original cut of the film Something Wicked This Way Comes. Famously, when the film was finished, it was shown to a preview audience, and they didn't really think much of it, and the Disney studio went into a panic and decided they must remake this film. They've got to rework it. So they spent a year reshooting scenes from the film, bringing back some of the actors, the child actors who were, I guess, about 12 years old when the first shooting was done. They were now a year or a year and a half older. Didn't look the same at all, about 2 feet taller than they were before. And you can see that in the final version of the film. The children suddenly age for some scenes and then go back to being normal again. But the original cut of that film has never been released. There's no real evidence that it exists other than the stories people tell about it. And one day, when I was in the centre, I was just going through all the tapes because I was searching for television material primarily. And I just wanted to know what was on all these tapes. And this one said Something Wicked. I think it said first version or something like that. Handwritten. I think Bradbury's handwriting, but I can't quite remember. And I started playing the tape. Lo and behold, Something Wicked with a different title sequence, different opening, different ending. It was the first cut of the film, which I'd never seen before. Now, I'm sure Disney have a copy, so this almost certainly isn't totally unique, but it's really fascinating to know that Ray had his own personal copy of this first version of the film. And he personally was motivated to get the film changed. When they said we're going to remake it, reshoot it, he saw that as an opportunity to get the film made the way he would have preferred it to be, rather than the way it was being made, which was from a script that somebody else had tampered with. He was just like going back to the Lee Brackett situation where she would have been the credited writer even if she hadn't written the entire script. With Something Wicked, Bradbury was the credited writer even though other writers had interfered with the script. So
interesting. Yeah. So I'm getting details from this that I didn't really know, but I can imagine, Something Wicked is a pretty dark story. It's one that Stephen King absolutely loves and credits as a major influence. And if you read Something Wicked and then go on to read Stephen King's It, you will see Bradbury's influence, Something Wicked's influence on Stephen King's very long novel. But I imagine with it being Disney, they weren't known for dark films, especially in the early 80s. And so I imagine the studio wanted a more toned-down, family-friendly version, and then the writer, I'm sure, had a vision of it. And Bradbury, no doubt, thought that his book was the perfect screenplay.
Absolutely.
And didn't want anything changed,
That's right. Yeah. So, yeah, I'd totally forgotten about that tape. But I remember when I was there was a guy doing little filmed, documentary things in the centre. He filmed John talking about some Bradbury manuscripts and a book. And they said, would you talk about the tape? So I did one of these little 1 minute spiels about the
we've got to track this down and get it out there.
It's out there. It's out there somewhere.
Is it?
We put it on Facebook, but I've lost track of it. We'll have to dig it out.
Okay.
Put it out again.
Good. Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. It's amazing. You sleep a few times and 3 years pass, and what leaves your memory?
Well, thanks for the memory jog on that one. That's brilliant. I'll tell you another item that I find quite fun is the jar.
The jar. That's one of my favorites as well.
Yeah, it is just a jar full of brown liquid, but you still think when you peer into it that you must be able to see something in there. I'm sure there's a living creature in there, or a formerly living creature in there somewhere.
Do you want to tell about the jar, just for the sake of our listeners?
It's from the Alfred Hitchcock Hour adaptation of Bradbury's story, The Jar. And the Bradbury story is about a man who goes to a carnival, and for some reason he buys this jar full of some strange object. He thinks he sees life in there, he thinks he sees eyes and flesh, but he can't quite make out what's in there. It's kind of like one of those things you see in museums where things are in formaldehyde. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
So it's like one of those. It's sort of a strange creature. And this guy brings it home from the carnival, and everybody is fascinated by it. And the TV version of it, which I love, has all of the people who are fascinated by it sitting around it, more or less in a circle, and staring at it, pretty much in the same way that people sit around a TV screen and stare at it. So it's almost a satire on television, which I think is a nice twist to the original. But Ray somehow got to have the jar. I don't know how it came into his possession, but somehow it got into his hands and he kept it. And it's made its way all the way to Indianapolis now. Yeah.
And it really, that is, if our listeners believe in miracles, I think you could call the survival of that jar a miracle, because Dr. Eller has told me where it was placed in Ray Bradbury's basement office and how many times he almost knocked it over and had it fall on the concrete floor of Bradbury's basement office. And it really is miraculous that the thing has survived this long. And when we wanted to bring it out, the movers, and I say we, I was not with the center at the time, but when John wanted to bring it out, the movers refused to touch it unless the lid was sealed. So John very quickly had to do research and figure out how to get some sealant that would be clear.
It really makes you wonder what was in there, because it's only a film prop. So
I know. Yeah.
And yet we think that it has some of these magical values that the fictional jar had, but it's probably just a piece of rag and a boiled egg and some vinegar. It's probably all that's in there.
And maybe a couple of plastic eyeballs or something. Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder what it's up to with the lockdown. Has anyone been in there to check on the jar? Maybe it comes to life.
Yes, I was in there just last Thursday with our team members. This was our first time back in the center, actually doing physical work on site. And of course, we're all wearing masks and trying to keep 6 feet away from each other. But the jar is very good. The collection has been safe and secure during the lockdown. And perhaps maybe safer than it is when we are in there working, because there's no risk of knocking something over accidentally. Yeah, I mean, we're all always very careful, but to let things sit and be untouched is a great way of preserving them, I suppose. And maybe that's a silver lining to our pandemic. There's very few of those, it seems like.
Now, of course, 2020 is the Bradbury centenary or centennial year, and there were all sorts of events planned for this year, most of which have now been cancelled or postponed, or some of them have become online events. Were there any events that you particularly were going to be involved with, either you personally or the Bradbury Centre?
Yeah, absolutely. It was, even starting back in March, the Bradbury Center was going to have a very prominent role at Concoction, which is Cleveland, Ohio's annual science fiction convention. So I was going to go and be part of the opening and closing ceremonies, and they also had me slated to do 4 programs. And the week before, they had to cancel that, unfortunately. Indiana Comic-Con, which is not as large as the San Diego Comic-Con International, but it's still quite a large regional event for us. We were going to have a virtual VR display, because we have done some 3D imaging of our artifacts. And so people could put on the goggles and put on the hand things, and they can actually go in and pick up objects. They could pick up the Mars globe and the Nautilus and things like that. And we're also going to do a panel on Ray Bradbury's history of comic books, comic adaptations of his works. But fortunately, that was canceled. Worldcon is taking place in New Zealand, and they did not cancel that. They've moved that to a virtual format. So the Bradbury Center will be participating in the program. I'm an attending member. And so we will be doing a real-time virtual tour of the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies at some point during that weekend. There's been a couple of NEA Big Read events. I know that the American Writers Museum in Chicago still plans. I mean, at this point, I think they were hoping to have the Ray Bradbury exhibit live. They were going to borrow some of our artifacts for an exhibit there to honor Ray Bradbury. That's been pushed back till either later in this year or early next year. But they've also got an NEA Big Read grant, and I believe that we're going to be participating in that program in some form. And we're also going to be, I believe on October 7th in New Jersey, there's a affiliation of libraries that collaborated on another NEA Big Read grant. And we're going to be doing a real-time virtual tour for them. Their focus is Fahrenheit 451. So they're going to have a speaker come in and talk about Fahrenheit 451, and then they're going to have us do a real-time virtual tour of the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies and talk as much as we can about some of Bradbury's personal history, some biographical information for them. Those are just a few of the events. We had a very, very full schedule. And because of COVID and because of this very strange time that we're all living in, Bradbury's Centennial is going to be extended into 2021. And events that we couldn't get to this year, we're going to try to take what we had prepared for those events and do those in other contexts next year.
I do remember a couple of years ago when I was talking to John about 2020, he was even then talking about finding ways of sort of stretching that centennial year and saying, well, Bradbury would have been 100 for a whole year, so it's not just the one day. You're entitled to carry it on till the following year because he still would have been 100. So yeah, that's fair enough. If you had to choose just one piece of Bradbury, short story, novel, anything you like, what would you choose? Let's say you're on a desert island and you're only allowed to take one thing with you. Which Bradbury would you take?
Well, if I'm only allowed to take one collection, it would be the October Country, because that has my favorite Bradbury story in it, the lake. Okay. And I appreciate the spookier side of Bradbury anyway. Of course, that has the jar, and the scythe, and so many wonderful and really, really unique stories. He doesn't follow the typical tropes of the horror genre. He goes for the weird and the eerie and the haunting. But if I was to pick a collection, it would be October Country because of the lake and because of how important that has been to me in my entire teaching career. But I think The Illustrated Man may be my favorite overall collection as far as just fantastic stories.
Yeah.
But man, that's tough. But I love The Illustrated Man. I love the framework, the way that he wove those stories together. With the Illustrated Man whose tattoos move, who's tattooed by a witch from the future, and so you've got these disparate science fiction stories. How do you bring them all together under a common theme, and to kind of tell these individual short stories within a broader narrative of a man encountering another man who has tattoos from head to toe I just think it's brilliant.
Do you not think it's crazy?
Well, yeah, but the craziness is what makes it brilliant and ties it together. I take it you've got a different opinion of the collection than I do.
Oh, not at all.
Gotcha.
The Illustrated Man has got some of his best stories, undoubtedly. I just think the linking device is coming from a totally different angle. To the most of the stories are sort of cautionary science fiction tales, and then the framing narrative is this total fantasy about tattoos. doesn't seem to connect for me. It's very well done, but they're like at 90 degrees to each other.
Right. Yeah, he's setting a fantasy armature and then infusing science fiction into it. I love it. I thought it was such a cool concept. But what about you? What is Bradbury's best collection if you're going to take one book?
I think I always go to The Golden Apples of the Sun. And it's possibly because that was the first Bradbury that I was introduced to. Possibly also because it's got, well, at least two stories that really grabbed me on first reading. Now, I think I would have been about 12 when I read that book, and it was a book that my English class was given. So, all these school kids were just given this book to read, and we read the short stories, and we were looking at the composition more than anything, I suppose. The use of language, not so much the story structure, but the use of descriptive language and that sort of thing. And I think that was the first piece of literature that I'd been given that I actually enjoyed. In British schools, you tended to be given things like, Jane Austen, Dickens, Shakespeare, and there are some nice things in those, but they're not the kind of thing that you would read when you're off duty. But with the Bradbury stuff, I found myself reading ahead because the stories were so fascinating. And the two stories for me, which absolutely blew my mind when I was 12 years old, are The Fruit at the Bottom of the Bowl, which is about this guy who becomes he kills somebody and then becomes obsessed with cleaning up the fingerprints that would link him with the killing. And he begins to see fingerprints everywhere. He realizes he touched the table, he touched the glass, he touched the shelf, he touched the doorknob. Did he touch the chandelier up there? Maybe he touched the chandelier. So he starts polishing every part of the chandelier, even though he couldn't possibly have touched it. So it's this total obsession. And I just think that's a fabulous story. And the other one is A Sound of Thunder, which is the classic time travel, go back and hunt dinosaurs story, time paradox, all of that. So those stories absolutely blew my mind when I first read them, because they were just so incredibly creative and beautifully written as well. There's not a word wrong in either of those stories as far as I'm concerned. So I always go back to Golden Apples of the Sun. There's some stories in there that when I leaf through it, I think, well, actually, I don't really remember that story, or that story doesn't engage me very much. But there are enough really great stories in that book that it's my favourite.
Well, I agree with you. Those stories resonated with me, and for a while there, I was trying to bring my children. I've got two daughters that are middle school age now, but they were in grade school when I started reading Bradbury to them. And for a very long time, Fruit at the Bottom of the Bowl, they both loved that story. Now, Dr. Eller said, you're going to make your kids really weird reading those kind of stories at such a young age. But they got they were so tickled by this guy basically causing his own demise by trying to cover up his crime. Yeah, no, I agree. Very good collection. Some wonderful stories in there. I remember the first time I read that was the summer, just a few weeks before I started officially working in the Bradbury Center. I had attended the first advisory board meeting for the Bradbury Center, because at that point I'd been accepted in the PhD program, and I was officially about to start, and was invited to the first advisory board meeting, and several members pointed to that as their first encounter with Ray Bradbury. And what stood out to me in that story was the big black and white game. Yeah. And the way that he was writing about race and looking at when the story was written, he was really very much ahead of his time. If not, we may not be able to consider Bradbury ahead of our 21st century ideals and understanding of those sorts of things. But he really was trying to use his platform as a writer to get white people to think about the injustices that were going on at the time. And not just in terms of laws, but in the way that people interacted with each other.
And you see that in a number of other stories as well, don't you? In Way in the Middle of the Air. Do you know that one from the Martian Chronicles?
Yes, from the Martian Chronicles, absolutely.
Where basically all the black people in America just decide they've had enough and they're going to go off to another planet. The interesting thing about that for me is that Bradbury later on came to realise that the real world had changed so much that story didn't really work for him anymore in the context of the Martian Chronicles. So in later editions, he took it out, not because of censorship or anything like that. It's just that he felt that the world had moved on and the book didn't really need that story anymore. Obviously, the story still exists and can be found in other collections. But I think that shows a kind of wisdom. And there's a sequel to that, which I think is called The Other Foot.
Yeah, in Illustrated
Man. Yeah. Where I can't remember that one terribly well, but I seem to recall that all the black people who've gone to Mars are sort of now happily set up on that planet, and they're sort of reflecting on their new position in that new world. So
and they see a rocket coming from Earth to Mars, and they know that there are white people
Oh, yes.
And
yes.
What are we going to do? How are we going to treat them? And one man becomes a leader and says, we're going to do to them exactly what they did to us. They're going to sit at the back of the bus.
Yeah.
They're going to sit in the nosebleed seats at the theater. Yeah. They're not going to be allowed to use this water fountain. And so they begin to kind of organize their towns in preparation for white people to be second-class citizens. And I think it was a powerful device. You couldn't get it published at the time. You had to wait until the Illustrated Man came out to get that published in his collection, because nobody would touch it. It was a very different time in America, and a very unfortunate time. And Bradbury was doing everything he could from his place to be an advocate for change.
That's really good to hear you say that, actually. Just occasionally we hear criticisms of Fahrenheit 451 because there are some sections in there which are not actually Bradbury the author talking. They are one of Bradbury's characters talking. So I'm thinking in particular of Beatty giving his explanation of how the world came to be the way it is, with all the censorship and burning of books and all of that. And Beatty blames it on minorities. Now he doesn't.
The tyranny of the minority.
The tyranny of the minority. That's right. But I think people looking at that today who aren't familiar with the sort of the context in which it was written tend to look at it and see the word minorities and immediately think ethnic minorities, that this is a criticism of ethnic minorities, which to me is firstly a misreading of the word minorities in that context, but it's also missing the fact that these words are coming out of the villain of the novel. They're not coming out of the narrator or the hero. This is the evil guy, if you like, justifying his own existence. So I think sometimes Bradbury is misunderstood, but
yes. I agree. And there's a section in Fahrenheit that I love, and I believe it's when Montag encounters his sort of mentor figure who helps, if Clarice is his herald, who wakes him up and alerts him that he needs to go on his adventure and start exploring literacy and the benefits of it. The name of his mentor figure is escaping me. Can you help me out?
Faber?
Yes, Faber. Never hide your ignorance, because if you hide it, nobody will hit you and you will never learn. And I absolutely love that. There's some wisdom in that. Well, and in 2015 I was finishing up my second master's degree, which was a master's in English, and I was sitting in Dr. John Eller's class. Of course, he was the director of the Bradbury Center at the time and chancellor's professor of English. And he brought in some photocopies of the original draft of Fahrenheit 451 that had Bradbury's personal edits. He had it typed up, and then he wrote in marker, his changes that he wanted to make. But it really was fascinating, because it hadn't been, in maybe 5 or 6 years since I first encountered Fahrenheit 451 for the first time. To see that famous opening line, "It was a pleasure to burn," was there from the very beginning. It was just really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I love in looking at Bradbury's scripts, which is obviously my fascination. But looking at different drafts of Bradbury's script, and particularly when you come across a page where he has hand corrected or hand annotated something, and you do see through successive drafts, he will tweak and he will change. But eventually he will come to the kind of perfect form of words, and it will stay there for the next, 15, 20 drafts. But there's clearly something in his approach to writing which is about seeking perfection. But he doesn't necessarily know which direction perfection is in. He just knows that I've got to change it. So he'll make a change, and then the next time round he might change that to something else again. But eventually every sentence will find its own perfection, its kind of plateau that it'll settle to. And I find that fascinating. Yeah. It's also infuriating, because you think this must be the the definitive version of this text, and then you find there's another draft. And I've got to compare these two now. Where I really don't envy John, because the collected stories was all about comparing all of these different drafts and collating them. That drives you mad, I think, to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Phil, how did you get into Bradbury? I know that you encountered him when you were 12, but what made you decide to, kind of make this your academic area of very high expertise?
I like that phrase. There were really two things that came together there. One was that I was fascinated by script writing. And I knew fairly early on that Bradbury had been a scriptwriter. This was when I was in my teens, really. So I'd read his books, and I knew that he was a scriptwriter because it said so on the back cover of some of the books. But none of those films seemed to exist, with the exception of Moby Dick. The back cover copy of his books mostly referred to films that just didn't exist. There was one called The Dreamers, which was never made, and there was another one, trying to think what it was. Might have been And the Rock Cried Out, which is a well-known Bradbury story, but there is no such film. And this fascinated me. Where were these films? Why were people saying that he wrote these films when they clearly don't exist? And of course, over time, I came to realize that lots of scripts get written, very few get turned into actual films, and that was what was happening to Bradbury. So I became quite fascinated by that, and I just started keeping notes and records and lists. Like, some people keep records of football scores or baseball scores, that sort of thing. I would keep notes on everything that I found where Bradbury had mentioned a script or been involved with a film. So this was just like a weird hobby of mine. So that's one interest, if you like, one hobby interest. But then the academic side of it was, there came a point where I was thinking of doing a PhD, and I thought, well, what on earth could I do a PhD about? And I was being lazy. I was thinking, I want to do something that won't involve too much work. And I thought, I already know lots of stuff about this Bradbury script writing, so perhaps I should use that as my focus. Boy, was that a big can of worms that I'd opened.
You really went down the rabbit hole, didn't you?
Absolutely. Well, the thing that happened, ironically, is it was when Ray died, and his papers became available through the Bradbury Centre. That completely changed really what my PhD would have been. If Ray hadn't died, or if his papers hadn't ended up in a research centre, I would have been restricted pretty much to looking at stuff that had been published. I could still have done the PhD, and I'd done quite a lot of the work at that point, but mostly I would have been looking at published books, published scripts, published radio plays, TV dramas, and films. And it would have all been about that aspect of Bradbury's work, which would have been okay, but it would have been a misleading impression of what Bradbury's screenwriting was really about. But because the papers became available through the Bradbury Centre, that opened up this whole new area for me to look at. So most of what went into my PhD is stuff that came after Bradbury's death. And in a way, it's fortunate that I took so long to do my PhD. I took 8 years to do it, which is ridiculous. Should have done it in 3, but it took me 8 years. But that meant that I had access to all this material that was gifted.
Well, Phil, you shouldn't beat yourself up on that too much. I'm working on my dissertation right now, and I can totally see how a dissertation can take 8 years.
I'm conscious of the time running away with us now, so I think I'll draw this to a close. Just to finish, is there anything that you would like to mention that we haven't talked about? Anything upcoming for you of the Bradbury Centre?
Yeah, I can't think of anything. Probably as soon as we wrap this up, I will say, oh, I should have said this. That's what do the French call it? The spirit of the staircase. Yeah. But no, right now Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in the podcast, and I think you're doing some wonderful things, Phil. But always got immense respect and appreciation for what you do for the world of Ray Bradbury, and so glad to have you as a senior advisor to the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies.
My thanks once again to Jason Aukerman for joining me today. I'll put links to the Centre for Ray Bradbury Studies on my own website, bradburymedia.co.uk. And join me please next week for another episode of Bradbury 100. Bye now. Bradbury 100 is presented and produced by Phil Nichols in collaboration with the Centre for Ray Bradbury Studies. Additional technical production is by Zachary Sokol. For more information, head to bradburymedia.co.uk. Music is provided by Purple Planet at purpleplanet.com.